So let's jump right in.
Yeah.
And I wanted to begin with, of course, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, which include historic investments in tackling climate change. So can you remind us what some of the key commitments that are in there, and where are we today when it comes to delivering on those investments?
Together, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. And let me say, grateful to be here, grateful to be part of this conversation, an important one at an important time. Together, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act really position the United States to step up and lead on climate, not just in the power sector or transportation, but for the first time really looking at the entire economy, agriculture, industry, buildings, and seeing how we can bend the curve in every single one of those. The goal is to build the enabling infrastructure across the country, the poles and the wires, the charging networks that we need, make sure we're laying the cable, and then to surge deployment of technologies that we know are going to bend the curve on the grid and in terms of transportation as well. We also want to make sure that we're facilitating capital formation in profound fashion to reshore supply chains that have left the U.S. and gone overseas, supply chains that we're going to rely upon if we're going to accelerate action at the pace and scale that we need. So $370 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act, over $100 billion in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, together over 1 gigaton of emissions reduction potential annually, ramping up in 2030 and beyond. And what we're seeing in the ground today is projects being built. $210 billion have been announced into the batteries and EV transformation, $450 billion of capital formation more broadly catalyzed against a clean energy economy that we need. And we're seeing people make commitments in places that I think looked like they were impossible to decarbonize before. Companies like Cleveland Cliffs investing in clean steel manufacturing here in the United States. We got a group of industrial sector folks who joined the White House focused on cement and aluminum being clean. 60,000 farms, 25 million acres now signed up for climate-smart agriculture practices. So the transformation is real, and we're incredibly excited about it.
I think, you touch on some really important pieces there, and what I'm hearing you say is this idea of a whole of government approach, right?
Yeah.
That's the only way to go about these. And these are certainly huge victories, but tell me a little bit more about what more needs to be done to get to that 50% reduction in emissions target by 2030. And how is the administration thinking about untapped opportunities when it comes to reaching net zero?
So, if you go back in time to the U.S. target into the Paris Agreement, we were looking at high 80% by mid-century. Now we're looking at net zero, economy-wide decarbonization. So thing number one is there's no sort of haven for emissions in our economy, and in part because now we have technologies like clean hydrogen and high heat potential from renewables and new material science that allows us to knock out emissions in places we wouldn't have imagined before. So thing number one that I think we wouldn't have guessed a few years ago, where I see a ton of potential, is the industrial sector. We've got now folks that are not only manufacturing at pilot scale cleaner building materials, but you've got organizations procuring those materials. You got companies like Ford and GM actually procuring on a forward contract basis for clean steel. That's catalyzing capital formation in the supply chain. Now those products are surging forward. As a federal government, we're using the buy clean approach, the power of our procurement, to create a market for these technologies. And by the way, we've now got over a dozen states signed up to do the same thing. If cement were a country, it would be a G10 polluter on its own. So this is really, really exciting stuff. The other place I think we're excited is the ag and forestry sector. At the White House, we've got a climate policy office for the first time in the Biden-Harris administration. We got someone working on every sector of the economy. We've got a director for lands and climate smart agriculture. You wouldn't have guessed that even being a focus years ago. We're doing it. It's real life today.
That's awesome. And your comment on cement actually reminded me, my team at FP Analytics, the Research and Advisory Division of Foreign Policy, did some research last year to coincide with COP27, looking specifically at health. And we know that the health industry would be the equivalent of the 5th largest polluter if it was a country. So I think that's a really, really important point that you were saying about cement, about ag, about every sector.
And on the whole of government, we've got the Department of Health and Human Services. By the way, Secretary Becerra and I visited the Children's Hospital here in D.C. that's part of our Climate Health Challenge, and our Veterans Affairs, who are working on decarbonization from anesthetics and other places where we have high-potency GHG leakage, reducing the emissions in the sector. So every sector has an opportunity to be part of the solution set.
Absolutely, and especially, as you said, when it comes to supply chains, how do we make supply chains more resilient and more green? But I want to go to something else that you mentioned, which is the Paris Climate Agreement. And so let's shift our focus a little bit to the international stage. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the U.S.'s role globally in the fight against climate change, and what, in your view, are the key achievements of this administration, and how are you thinking about the road to COP28?
Yeah, you know, we've come a long ways from the Paris Climate Agreement. We've moved along technology cost curves. When we were talking about solar and wind and batteries at the time, the technologies cost maybe a factor of 2 or a factor of 3 more than they do today. They're easier to harness and I think more harmonized with our development objectives. You know, you look at places like India that have really accelerated on energy access, but are at the same time putting a lot of investment into accelerating deployment of solar. We've got to do that around the world, move forward in tandem on energy access and clean energy, and they're not at conflict with one another. So I think, you know, what I'm excited about, and folks will probably hear from the Development Finance Corporation of the Biden-Harris administration, is not just that we're helping deploy these technologies around the world, but we're actually helping manufacture them around the world. First Solar, which is a company here founded in the United States, now has a factory in Tamil Nadu manufacturing these panels. We got to make sure everyone sees the economic upside, the uplift opportunity of switching to cleaner energy. So thing number one is, how can we help how can we help outsource this playbook of economic uplift when you tackle climate change? Thing number two is finance. Last week, the President of the United States convened the major economies of the world. And by the way, the major economies of the world should be responsible for making the major dent in emissions around the world. And he got them together around a few different big pillars of action. One of them was accelerating climate finance. And as part of that, the U.S. moved out on $1 billion into the Green Climate Fund, which, by the way, now has mobilized 10 times as much funding, hundreds of projects around the world. That's the kind of work we have to do. So we got to push out on this playbook that I think works here but works everywhere, and that's a playbook of economic uplift. We have to help with finance, and that means not just finance on mitigation technologies, but on resilience and adaptation. You've got countries underwater. We've got to be front of the line helping them build back better. And then third, we've got to help continue to drive down the cost curve here. There's been analysis that the Inflation Reduction Act, bipartisan infrastructure law, it's not just going to knock down technology costs for deployment here in the United States. It's going to knock down in the double digits technology costs to deploy all around the world.
Your comments are actually a perfect segue to where I wanted to go next. And, you mentioned the countries being underwater, and we had actually the Minister of Climate Change and the Environment, Cherry Rahman of Pakistan, earlier on the program. But I think one of the things that's really important to remember is that the impacts of climate change are uneven across the globe. And those countries which are most vulnerable are both the ones that have contributed often the least to the problem and are also the least resourced. And you touched on financing. And there are a lot of solutions and opportunities that have been discussed today, but everything takes money, obviously. So tell me a little bit about how the U.S. is delivering on the president's pledge of $11.4 billion for international climate financing. How are we getting there, and will we meet the 2024 target?
Yeah, look, I think I want to touch on your disproportionate impact piece. And it's an important one because it almost doesn't tell the whole story. If we just sort of look at the distributional impacts of climate change and we say, gee, it's really impacting lower income folks here in the United States, around the world, black and brown communities here in the United States and around the world, it doesn't tell the story because it suggests maybe it's an accident, right? And here in the United States, we know it's not an accident. Communities that were redlined because of a racist housing policy in the U.S. are literally hotter today because there's more pavement and fewer trees. And we're being deliberate about the work of repair in those communities. That's the mentality we've got to export to our development approach around the world. That's why this $1 billion, which moves us forward along the $11.4 billion commitment, is so important. That's why it's so important that the president has brought together nations from around the world to help do our part in restoring and preserving the Amazon, which is really the lungs of the planet. Last week at the Major Economies Forum, the U.S. stepped up with $500 million to the Global Amazon Fund to help do that important work. And we've got to bring other nations along in that work as well. And I think this availability of finance is so important. There are places around the world where there's still price discovery going on solar deployment, on wind deployment. There are places around the world where there's a lot of political insurance that needs to be available if folks are going to do the financing of the long life infrastructure, like the stuff you need to deploy offshore wind in island nations around the world. We're going to have to step up and help facilitate that. And, you know, there are other places in this challenge that I don't think we have solutions for yet. There is, foreign exchange risk when you're doing project finance around the world. How do we step up and surge the solutions? The U.S. will be part of that. Our DFC, our approach through the Treasury Department, our outbound contributions to funds like the GCF, our engagement in the conversation around loss and damage, those are important concepts, important vehicles, important institutions. The MDBs will be a big player in all of that. World Bank, IFC, others also stepping up with real concrete solutions. So we need philanthropy, we need governments around the world, we need the MDBs, and we need a new set of solutions because we've got to move really, really fast.
Agreed. And I appreciate your point about taking an intersectional approach when it comes to disproportionate impacts, whether that's race, class, or even gender. And we have Gillian Caldwell, who's the Chief Climate Officer at USAID, joining our program later. So it'll be an opportunity to talk about that more. I'd love to end on an optimistic note. The enormity of climate change can feel overwhelming. But let me ask you this to close off our conversation. What's giving you hope these days? What's making you feel excited about catalyzing climate action?
So much of the climate story is really told in this, in the key of doom and despair, right? You see the surging seas wreaking more and more destruction on our coastlines. You see the fires burning with greater fury out west here in the United States and around the world. The sky literally turning orange. Drought that felt like it was a cyclical challenge has become chronic in many places. It's really easy to get resigned in the face of that. But what we've seen here in the United States is that when you get a coalition together of labor and of industry, of folks in rural communities and urban, for young people who've stepped up and helped march and protest. And by the way, I think that's an important contribution and really has helped create the political space for the progress we've made. then you can take the big steps that this moment demands, and you can take it not just to reduce the pollution coming out of the sky, but actually to lift up people who've been left out of the economy for decades, systematically and structurally. You can use it to turn on communities that have been left behind, return economic opportunity places it left years ago, and you can use it not just to imagine plans that are pie in the sky, but really put steel in the ground and build projects. I think about the 389 school districts in the United States where a yellow school bus is now going to show up in front of a kid's house. The kid's going to get on the school bus, and instead of hearing the roaring diesel engine, them breathing in gunk into their lungs, they're going to hear the vehicle move quietly and cleanly from their home to the school. That kid knows that there are folks who see a place for them, who value them, who prioritize them, and that gives me hope that we can have a political system that the president, I think, has done an amazing job of leading and harnessing, that delivers results, that delivers this multiple bottom lines of benefit, and we can meet this moment. I'll literally close out because I know I'm over time, but I met in Sharm el-Sheikh at the COP, the United Nations, a young man from Ecuador who came up and he said to me, and this is the thing I carry with me every day. He said to me, I look at what the United States, President Biden, Vice President Harris have done in the last 2 years. Campaigned on climate, promised action, delivered results, and now you're building and doing stuff. That's what I take back home, and that's what I push my political leadership to do. That gives me the basis to know that what I'm dreaming, what I'm imagining is possible because you can do it in the United States. My folks brought us here from Pakistan. I think for so many people, the U.S. has been a beacon of hope and possibility on freedom and rights and liberty, on technology and innovation. It's so exciting to be part of a government at a moment that allows the U.S. to be a beacon of what's possible on climate at this moment of urgent need.
Well, I'm Bangladeshi American, so that couldn't resonate with me more. But thank you for ending on that hopeful note. Ali Zaidi, the National Climate Advisor at the White House.
Thank you so much.